Later in that same year of 1920, a Turkish army routed an Armenian army near Kars, far to the east, thereby ending any organized Armenian threat. But in the fall of 1920, Turkish forces were confronted by that Hellenic Greek army of some 200,000 men in the western part of Turkey, south of Izmit and west of Angora, and were stymied there. Initially, they were defeated badly and pushed by the Greeks. The two armies struggled to a draw and remained entrenched there against each other. As all of this was going on, what was happening in the Pontos? Although there was rumor of a so-called Pontos plot, whereby indigenous ethnic Greeks might rise and help an invading Greek army, clearly the vast majority of the ethnic Greeks and the remaining Armenians living in the Pontos were peaceful, mainly peasants living in the countryside with some businessmen in the cities. Yes, there were a few armed Greek and Turkish bands living in the mountains near Samsun, who raided each other and nearby villages from time to time. Many ethnic Greeks at Samsun during the Great War had taken to the hills in defense. After the war, some of them came down from the hills, but others did not. Americans reported the meetings with some of the Greek bands in the hills. With such hazy threats as pretext, in December of 1920, a brutal Turkish general known in American reports as Nurettin Pasha was sent by the nationalists with an army of 10,000 men to pacify the entire region. Later, in June of 1921, after a Greek warship bombarded Inebolu, and at General Nurettin's suggestion, the Nationalist Assembly voted to deport to the interior all male ethnic Greeks living in the Pontos between 15 and 50 years of age. As we will see, pacify the region, Nurettin certainly did. But one might more accurately say he utterly devastated it. He paid no attention to such minor distinctions as exact age limits or deportation of men only. When American relief worker Theda Phelps visited Angora for 3 weeks in September 1921, another American relief worker named Annie Allen assured her, based on what Allen had been told by the nationalist government, that there would be no general deportation, but the men who were being sent inland away from their homes would be enduring a mere military necessity. Phelps was quite impressed with the Turkish officials she met at Angora, and so she was guardedly optimistic. As she said then, "I was shown every courtesy, entertained cordially, and felt a very friendly interest in the new government. I told Miss Allen I was willing to believe in them if there were no Greek deportation and atrocities such as I had seen in 1915, 16, and 17. Then Phelps traveled on to Sivas, where she was to do relief work. When she arrived at that city, she was dismayed to find a general deportation of Greeks from the coast in full swing, and what is more, it had been going on for months, and was going on while I was being promises in Angora that no such thing should occur. If anyone here doesn't know, the deportations were those forced murderous treks across much of the Turkish subcontinent of old men, women, and children, most of the adult men having been massacred at the start or sent into so-called labor battalions in which it took a bit longer for them to die. Of the women, children, and old men Phelps usually saw upon the road, she commented, "The government makes no provision for food or care of any kind for these persons said to be safely conducted from the war zone." Many Americans pointed out that the gendarmes regularly forbid the Greeks to drink from the streams they crossed, besides robbing and abusing them to no end. The circumstances at Harput were as bad as any American relief worker, American relief worker Ethel Thompson worked there for a year and remarked that, and I quote, "The heaviest winter weather, when howling blizzard was raging during blinding snowfall, was the favorite time chosen by the Turks to drive the Greeks on. Thousands perished in the snow. The road from Harput to Bitlis was lined with bodies." Several times, the American relief director in Harput had begged the Turkish officials to allow the Americans to take into their orphanages the Greek children whose mothers had died upon the trails. This request she said, was always refused. Finally, after many weeks of continued appeals, they promised that we could take an old building formerly belonging to German missionaries and keep the Greek children there. We did this and issued a week's rations of food, gave them some clothes. But in a very few days, the building was empty. The Turks had driven the children over the mountain. Thompson pointed out that the Near East relief people here were helping ethnic Turks as well as ethnic Christians, but it made no difference. We were supporting the Turkish orphanage and allowing the Turkish poor as well as supporting the Armenian orphanages and aiding with clothes and food when we were allowed to do so. The ghastly lines of gaunt, starving Greek women and children who staggered across Anatolia in the Greek city of Harput. Skeleton babies tied to their backs, driven on without food supplies or clothing until they dropped dead, Turkish gendarmes hurrying them with their guns. She concluded, Anatolia has been, for the past year, an open graveyard. One could go on and quote at length from a dozen American relief workers' accounts about the suffering, the dying, and the dead they saw strewn everywhere along the roads south from the Pontos over the next year. But what did the relief workers find when they reported the terrible conditions they had seen to the admiral back in comfortable Constantinople? Edith Wood had been at Malaysia, where the Greek children came to her in the very last stages of exposure and starvation. She lamented that the children would often be gone even before I had taken their names. In Malaysia, bodies lay all about in the streets and the fields with no attempt to bury them. And they receive us coldly in Constantinople, she reported, when we want to tell what we know and let it appear very clearly that my story is unwelcome and that I am a hysterical woman, exaggerating or falsifying. That is the way it is. Given such typical treatment by Bristol, sometimes the American relief workers did not make their reports to the admiral, but sent them to the State Department instead in Washington. For Bristol's policy was to hush things up. After all, atrocities were bad for American business, and business was his first concern. As for his opinions of the Turks, according to the admiral, all these Eastern races were equally atrocious, and those who knew how to get along with the Turks usually had little trouble. Despite such opinions, regularly repeated in Bristol's war diaries and correspondence, even the admiral sometimes had to confront people who were listening to the relief workers and taking them seriously. For some events were taking place even under the nose of his own destroyer captains at Samsun. Over the next year, Bristol would hear regular reports from his senior officers at that port city about nearby villages being destroyed, ethnic Greek males killed, and Greek women and children being herded south by Turkish soldiers to an uncertain anonymous fate. For example, at the beginning of the fearful summer of 1921, relief worker Gertrude Anthony, a niece of Susan B. Anthony, was at Samsun, awaiting Turkish permission to travel inland. Although measures had apparently been taken to see that the foreigners in this port city could not witness much firsthand, Anthony reported that there were reports of the destruction of the Greek villages and massacre of the villagers in the coast region. These reports were corroborated by the influx of Greek children at our orphanages. A little village called Upper Samsun was close enough, however, that the Americans could see directly some of what was happening there. As Anthony noted, after the hurried removal of the people, the houses were stripped of doors, windows, and boards and timbers. Numbers of Turkish villagers passed the hospital every day for several weeks, carrying this loot on the backs or on donkey. Later still, an order was issued that all outsiders, that is, inhabitants of nearby villages who had sought safety in Samsun, must now be sent south. Frantic women at times beseeched the officials, the Americans, and others for release from the order or for refuge. It is certain that not all obeyed the order, that many were driven out. No one in Samsun, I think, she said, doubts that they were destroyed. When Osman Aga's remorseless Laz bandits arrived, warnings from friendly Turks about imminent deportations were passed on from the Greeks in the city to the American women there. And with other events, these warnings convinced Anthony to protest to Commander Joyce of the American destroyer at the port, Joyce passed along her protest along with his own conclusions in a plea that asked Bristol to intercede, and the admiral in response reluctantly protested officials at Samsun. For a while, or not for long, the threat was called off. Some weeks later, the admiral was involved against his will more deeply yet. And this section of my talk might be entitled, "How do you get your boss to act against genocide when he is inclined simply to ignore it all?" In a meeting with the Nationalist Foreign Minister at Angora in June of 1921, one of Bristol's staff officers was assured that no women or children would be deported, only men of military age. Yet 6 weeks after that, one of the 2 American destroyer captains who were in Samsun had the following conversation with the local governor about reports that all remaining Greeks in the city were to be deported, something that he said was naturally regarded as the end by everybody. The governor said the order was indeed in effect, and that all Greeks had been notified. They soon would be sent out. The Turkish governor admitted many of the Greek men who had been deported earlier had in fact been killed, though he claimed the government had tried to protect them. With a fortunate result, at least half of them had reached their destination. Destroyer Overton's captain, Commander G.L. Bristol, not related to the admiral, asked how one was to consider this new deportation order, pointing out that the governor's assurances to him regarding the past deportations had not been adhered to in any particulars. When the governor responded that the women and children would be sent out in small, well-guarded parties and on all in conveyances, no one would have to walk, the commander answered that they both knew this was impossible. The American officer went on to say that he knew as well as I that large numbers of the deportees would not survive. The commander then protested in the name of humanity as strongly as he felt he could, but being the pretty low-ranking figure he was convinced it wasn't strong enough. After describing all this, the Overton's commander wrote the admiral laboriously in a handwritten letter of his conviction that the deportations would be carried out quickly, that the death of large numbers of old men, women, and children would be the natural consequence. He added this conclusion, and I quote, "American prestige is now at a low ebb here. We have the only war vessels in the harbor at present, whether true or not, are being put in the position of passively standing by and watching what everyone, including Turks, considers a massacre. The officials representing the government know that we don't believe what they say to us. They also know that we are fully convinced that few deportees will reach their destination alive. If this goes through, it will at a later date be classed with the Armenian affair, and we will occupy in the public mind very much the position of the Germans, who had been allies of the Turks during the war and saw what was happening then. Time will impute to us not only doing little to prevent it, but actually the attitude of complacency, if not concurrence, that we concurred in the death marches. There is a strong feeling amongst all, Turks included, that concrete action by the Allies or strong action by America can stop it. This must be communicated to Angora. The local Turk will not feel when you're dealing only with him. You are serious in your intentions. Note the perceptions here, startling in their clear contrast not only to the regular evasions by Turkish officials at Samsun, but also to the regular excuses of the American admiral in Constantinople. Turkish officials never mean what they say. We all know they don't mean it. Most deportees are likely to die. The orders come from Angora, that is from Mustafa Kemal, and if we do nothing, we're ourselves responsible. Commander Victor Stewart Houston of USS Brooks, for some reason both the destroyers Overton and Brooks were present simultaneously at Samsun, carried the Overton commander's message to Constantinople and urgently asked to speak to the admiral. The admiral's chief of staff wouldn't let him in. The admiral was busy, he said. Novelist John Dos Passos happened to be traveling through the region at the time as a kind of journalist. And a kind of careful reading of an episode in his 1927 travel book, Orient Express, tells us what happened next. In his book, the writer describes an extraordinary meeting at the Para Palace Salon between an American naval officer, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop, an elaborately dressed Greek lady, and a journalist, obviously Dos Passos. How Dos Passos got invited to this meeting is unknown, and anyway, it's much less an important question than who the naval officer was, what he thought he was doing, meeting the Greek patriarch. From archival sources, it's clear. The American pictured as speaking out in a meeting was Commander Houston, In his travel book, Dos Passos does not notice that by the ship's captain reporting what he and his crew had seen going on in Samsun to a major non-American authority and to other individuals not at all connected with the military mission, Commander Houston was not only likely violating naval protocol, but was circumventing his admiral's certain wishes. Did Admiral Bristol learn of and then take offense to Commander Houston's outspokenness? And had Commander Houston carefully measured the possible personal consequences of his attending an uncleared meeting with a local chief of state, as it were? In several respects, as I need not tell you, the Greek Archbishop or Primate acted as the head of all ethnic Greeks in Turkey. That is, had this experienced American naval officer, in frustration, decided to brave any possible damage to his own career so as to trumpet the word of the impending death marches to somebody who might help? Apparently he had. Naval documents indicate that the Greek Archbishop used Commander Houston's name with Houston's permission in pleading with Admiral Bristol for the ethnic Greeks of the Pontos, and that the Admiral took great offense at Houston's having let the Archbishop know what was going on there in Samsun. Naval personnel files contain the original copy of the letter that Bristol appended to the commander's next fitness report. In that letter, the Admiral pointed to Houston's violation of Bristol's policy of neutrality between local contending officials, local contending forces, the ship captain's certain knowledge of what that policy involved, and the overall lack of discretion in the commander's actions. In Houston's required response to this decidedly adverse letter, which would have ended any chance of his being promoted to captain, to the Admiral's wonderment, the ship captain dared to defend his actions. He had to write a letter by rule. He had to write a letter in response. In that letter, Houston explained that he had found his original report to headquarters about the Turkish orders to deport all the Greek women and children of Samsun was not being taken seriously back at the American embassy. This despite the death of, and I quote, thousands upon thousands of Armenian women and children during the war by similar methods. He went on to remind Admiral Bristol, the detachment commander, that although he had asked to see the Admiral personally, he had been turned down. As was informed, the Admiral was too busy to talk to him. Houston's letter displayed a sardonic tone. And again, I quote, I'm aware that the detachment commander is more than busy. I'm aware that my personal feelings are not to be considered, but in such a matter affecting the lives of 15,000 odd women and children not yet killed, the personal touch which a word